But, speaking of panic, Zoe,
Yes.
there are lots of people panicking about the outcome of this U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. Because Iran essentially won the war. That's where we're at now, is people are having to come, the people who were deluded enough to have those fantasies of just, complete hegemony and domination over the region, which, had overthrowing the government in Iran and turning it into a vassal state as one of their biggest fantasies. Those people are really having to, or they're either in denial or they're coming to terms with what happened, because Iran came out of this war in this position of strength. And it's really reverberating across the region. And I think the place it's reverberating most clearly, and maybe that's just because I am situated in Lebanon, but is in Lebanon, where the Israelis and their Lebanese allies, which I will refer to as the anti-resistance camp in Lebanon, are freaking the F out because they lost. They lost pretty bad. And it's only going to get worse for them from here, I think. Because, we talked a bit with Seamus about this, but that Switzerland hosted first round of US-Iran talks over the weekend set up this mechanism to monitor and enforce the Lebanon ceasefire. They're calling this mechanism a deconfliction cell. And, you might wonder, why is this significant? Well, it's significant because there was already this mechanism set up after the 2024 between Lebanon and Israel. The problem with that mechanism was that it was overseen by the U.S., which is Israel's biggest sponsor. So whenever Israel would violate the ceasefire after November 2024, when that war ended, they would do it with absolute impunity. They violated that ceasefire over 15,000 times, which is the reason Hezbollah entered this war against Israel when the Iran war started on March 2nd. Those 15,000 ceasefire violations killed literally hundreds of Lebanese people. And also, one of the central missions of that mechanism of the U.S. monitored ceasefire was the disarmament of Hezbollah south of the Litani River. So this time around, with this deconfliction cell that the U.S. and the Iranians agreed to be a part of at the Switzerland talks, Israel isn't even a direct participant in that mechanism, which means, but more importantly, Iran is a direct participant. And that means that there's now somebody who's at the table to monitor this ceasefire who will be willing to push back and actually impose consequences if and when, and it's more when, Israel violates the agreement. Now, this is a huge, tectonic shift, because it means Lebanon now has leverage like it's never had before. And this U.S.-Iran deconfliction cell also pretty dramatically undermines these Lebanon-Israel direct negotiations that have been taking place in Washington, D.C. In fact, today was the fifth round of those negotiations. It may actually still be taking place right now. And those talks were basically entirely focused on disarming Hezbollah, and a ceasefire was later down the list. It was completely on Israel's terms. It was basically the Lebanese government collaborating with the Israelis and the Americans against Hezbollah, which is why the anti-resistance camp in Lebanon was spearheading those talks and is still begging for those talks to continue, even though they have actual leverage now to end the war through Iran. And by the way, those talks, those ceasefire direct negotiations talks that never resulted in a ceasefire, were happening while Israel continued to bomb and occupy Lebanon. And at one point, there was an agreement that in those talks that Israel had no hostile intent towards Lebanon. That is what the Lebanese president agreed to, as Israel's bombing every single day the country and stealing more territory. So now Iran has a seat at the table, while that framework, which delivered literally nothing to the Lebanese, has been weakened. And that's why, coming back to Lebanon's anti-resistance camp, they're in a total panic. These people declared victory so early on and were in total denial that Iran would likely win this war, much like the neocons who launched it were. They were doing a victory lap as soon as Hezbollah basically entered the war and Israel started bombing. And as soon as they got their direct negotiations, another victory lap. And now they're in a really tough spot because Iran is not going away. And by aligning with Iran and fighting alongside Iran, Hezbollah is coming out of this also empowered, as Iran is. So this anti-resistance crowd has so far since this mechanism, this deconfliction cell came into place, Zoe, they've released this petition of like 400 signatures insisting that we must continue direct negotiations, we must disarm Hezbollah, and reject Iran's role in securing a ceasefire for Lebanon, which they, by the way, call that interference. They're accusing Iran of interference for securing a ceasefire in Lebanon. These people are so ridiculous. And also, you guys, I'm sure your 400 signatures petition is totally gonna, make all this stop, and the U.S. is gonna go, you know what? Forget this deconfliction cell. We're going back to the status quo. You also have Lebanese Forces Party leader Samir Jaja, who literally wrote a letter to J.D. Vance begging him to stop Iran from
Mr.
helping
Vance,
to monitor
please.
the ceasefire in Lebanon. I'm not joking. This letter was absurd for a lot of reasons. It also claimed that before the past 40 years of Hezbollah's existence, Lebanon was a beacon of stability in the region. I'm like, what the F are you talking about? It's also, by the way, important to remember that the Lebanese Forces Party, under the direction of Samir Jaja, carried out the Sabra and Shatila massacres back in 1982. And this party also has a history of collaborating with the Israelis. Obviously, that was part of the Sabra and Shatila massacres was overseen by the Israelis. They were the ones who carried out the executions. Anyways, these anti-resistance people, they need to learn to accept a Lebanon where Iran has influence, because Iran is a major regional power. And I don't mean where Iran controls the country, it's just where Iran has influence, just like Saudi Arabia and the US have influence. The thing is, they have no problem with US and Saudi influence, because that's who basically backs them. And anyways, they also, on top of that, I mean, it sucks. Lebanon's a tiny country, so of course all these bigger players are going to be influencing Lebanon. That's just the way it works. It's not ideal, it's the way it works. But these people also need to learn to live with their fellow countrymen. They need to learn to live in a Lebanon where Hezbollah is a popular party because it has a massive base. And as a popular party with a massive base, it's going to be a powerful player in the country. So they have to learn to coexist with this party. It's not going anywhere. And they need to do that instead of relying on the Israelis to try to bomb Hezbollah out of existence, because that's never worked, and that is incredibly destructive for the country, including for them. So at the end of the day, too, this is another, I think this is why I go back to my initial point, is this is a reflection of who lost this war. And they did. And we're going to see more signs of that, I think, as time comes. And another sign of that is the fact that, Trump publicly came out and admitted that he's been asking the Syrian president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, to basically step in and fight Hezbollah for Israel. Ahmed al-Sharaa actually gave an interview over the weekend and was asked to address this. And he basically politely said, no, thank you.
I'm good.
Obviously, no goodwill towards Hezbollah, not a fan, very much against, he said we're very much upset that they intervened in Syria on the side of Bashar al-Assad. However, we're not interested in going to war with Lebanon, and this can't be resolved through war. And also, Syria's got better things to do than to go to war with Lebanon. He's got a country to run. He's got minorities to kill in Syria. That's kind of what his forces are doing. Long list of things, but also he's literally trying to impose control over all of Syria and having a very difficult time doing that. Having to deal with the Israelis still kind of bombing them sometimes and doing raids. And having to deal with trying to bring this country out of over a decade of regime change war that left its economy completely battered in addition to its infrastructure. So has enough on his plate. And then also don't forget, Syria has to answer to Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And Turkey and Saudi Arabia have essentially vetoed the idea of Syria getting involved in Lebanon. And don't forget, the Israeli leaders keep on saying that after Iran, Turkey is next. So Erdogan is not going to try to weaken Hezbollah when that's an obstacle to Israel moving on to Turkey. And Saudi Arabia at this point wants a stable region, and a Syrian invasion of Lebanon would be chaotic. It would be chaos, not stability. Now for the Israelis are pissed, right? Israeli leaders keep saying that they're never going to leave Lebanon, but they did, as Seamus mentioned during our segment with him, they've announced a drawback of their so-called offensive forces. Like I mentioned earlier, they haven't bombed Lebanon since Saturday, though they did kill 2 Lebanese today in gunfire in Nabati. Hezbollah has called this a violation of the ceasefire. We'll see how that plays out. But all that's to say, this is the longest stretch of Lebanon not being bombed since this war began. And then the New York Times had this article out saying that the Israeli military has basically received updated directives that they would no longer be conducting proactive strikes in Lebanon. They've restricted soldiers to defensive actions, though, of course, whatever that means for Israel is typically offensive anyways, but whatever. That's a change in directives. And they've also prohibited the Israeli military from firing warning shots at civilians that are attempting to return south. And they've prohibited them from blowing up houses. Which is something that they were doing before, from blowing up villages. So Israeli media is freaking out. They're saying this could be a slippery slope, that if the restrictions on Lebanon are allowed to stand, maybe Gaza and the West Bank are going to be next. And to that, I say, let's all hope so. Let's all hope it's a slippery slope. And the last thing I'll say on this, Zoe, is that, the Israelis in this anti-resistance camp in Lebanon, they're trying to frame at this point any Israeli loss or withdrawal or like a pulling back of, constant murder in Lebanon as a result of the direct negotiation track in Washington. And to that I say, fine, take all the credit you want. I don't care. I just want the war to be over. At the end of the day, that's all that matters. But also, if Israel does end up withdrawing, anyone with a brain is going to understand that is the doing of Iran pressuring the Americans, no matter how hard the anti-resistance crew across the region tries to spin it. Just like everyone recognizes that Lebanon not being carpet bombed since Saturday is because of Iran.
Yeah, it's a point that's important to make. All of these Gulf countries throughout the genocide in Gaza, released statements, said we do not support, maybe they said they condemn, and they have done nothing to restrain Israel. And Iran has shown that it is the only country that is actually capable and willing to restrain Israel, and actually putting its own ceasefire on the line is something that no other country in the world has been willing to do. And I think there's, parallel cases of, even with regards to Cuba, no country has been willing to put really any part of its, security on the line to help Cuba in the same way that Iran is doing this with Lebanon. And I think we've brought up the question about Gaza and what happens now with Gaza. We published a piece on breakthroughnews.org last week about how the second phase of ceasefire talks are going and the position of the Palestinian resistance factions. I highly recommend that people check it out because, again, firing and strikes in Gaza has resumed. We've seen there was another Al Jazeera journalist that was killed, I think, in recent days. Children are still being killed. It continues to be really horrific. There are developments on the political front in terms of what those talks look like. The resistance factions have said, again, that they will not disarm while all of this is happening. And that is what Israel and Washington have demanded. And so I think it will be interesting to see kind of if this chapter with the Iranian front, with the Lebanese front, does in some way cool down, how will powers in the region react to continued ceasefire violations in Gaza, which previously had been kind of central, for a lot of these countries?
So I think you're absolutely right in the long term. In the short term, unfortunately, I think that we can expect that the Israelis will be taking out their frustration over Lebanon in places like Gaza and the West Bank. Lebanon is a country, so it has a few more tools. And it's looked at differently when it comes to Israeli behavior, whereas the West Bank and Gaza are full of Palestinians who have no rights because they have rights, but they're deemed to have no rights. They live under Israeli occupation and total control. And it's just, there's not as strong as a resistance there for that reason. I mean, Gaza's been under genocide for over 2+ years, and the West Bank has been pacified. Not entirely, but for the most part, because of the collaboration of the Palestinian Authority with the Israelis after the Oslo Accords. So it's a horrible situation because the Israelis have a long-term goal of taking as much territory with as few Arabs on it as possible. And their big goal, especially for the most messianic of them, is to include parts of Lebanon and Syria in that greater Israel project.
Right.
But, the most immediate term desire, even for, your least offensive Israelis, that's like being very generous, is West Bank and Gaza.
Right.
This is like a fascist society totally consumed by desires for settler colonialism, and that includes like land theft and genocide, and removing as many Palestinians as possible by as many, by any means necessary, basically. So there's less, and obviously, people keep asking, why isn't Iran,
right?
Why isn't Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz over Gaza? Why isn't Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz over the West Bank? And, we asked Mohammed Morandi that question, I think maybe last week we had him on. And I mean, he had a really interesting answer to that. And one of them, is that, I think this is, I don't really agree with this so much, but, like the Arab states have all stepped in and agreed that Gaza, like they agreed to the, Board of Peace plan or whatever, that, they agreed to the Gaza ceasefire,
Right.
and they put their signatures on that, and that's why. And I'm just like, come on. I mean, they also agree with all kinds of things on Lebanon, and Iran is fine by that. But he also gave another answer that I thought was interesting, and that is that Hezbollah and Iran are partners in this war.
Yeah.
And I mean, that makes sense to me. Like, Hezbollah literally entered this war after the U.S. and Israelis started bombing Iran. They chose that moment to enter, and the thinking went, and it's kind of panning out to have been strategically maybe wise, was, look, we're in a status quo that is not sustainable. Israel has violated the ceasefire over 15,000 times, killed hundreds of people. If we're going to enter a war with Israel, we need to do it when we're in a position of strength because we have a bigger power behind us.